Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So we're in for another series. So I took a break after the last series on Merleau-Ponty's The Visible and the Invisible. But yeah, it's time to get back into it. So this series is on Jacques Derrida. And yeah, we're just going to go through some of his earlier works and just to get a feel for Derrida's philosophy. If you've watched any of my videos before, Derrida as a topic might seem a little strange, and if you'd asked me probably even 8 months ago whether I was going to do a video on someone like Derrida, I would have flat out denied that was ever going to happen, because I've never liked Derrida. I've never liked postmodernism in general, and Derrida's kind of falls into that category quite nicely, I think. And my impression of postmodernism, it's still kind of the case, but it depends. But I have a more nuanced take on postmodernism now. But my impression at the time was like many people's, I think. Postmodernism doesn't really stand for anything. It criticizes anybody who does stand for something. So it's a very negative philosophy or movement, denies the existence of truth and meaning, and postmodern texts tend to be full of abstract, over-intellectualized language that just kind of moves in circles, doesn't draw any conclusions, doesn't say anything positive, but tries to kind of sound profound while it's doing all of that. So it was with that attitude that I went into of Grammatology, and essentially I was just looking to come to an understanding of why exactly I disliked Derrida. So I already knew I didn't like him, but the reasons I didn't like him were a little vague. It was I'd never read him, and so everything that I knew about him was at least second-hand, if not third or fourth-hand, and it was kind of couched in very general terms. So I wanted to find out why I didn't like him. I wanted to have substance behind my dislike of him. So I started reading it, of Grammatology, and it was a really kind of a bizarre experience that I started deliberately looking for things that I could criticize, that I didn't like, that I was going to disagree with, that were going to go into my arsenal of reasons why I don't like him. And I managed to find a few things at the beginning, and that I was ready to kind of put together into a full-blown criticism of him. And strangely, though, the things that I agreed with started to outweigh the things that I disagreed with. And it was a real, just a steady conversion, I guess, that took place while I was reading off Grammatology. And yeah, the things that I didn't like, I realized they weren't really there. I was looking for things that just weren't there. And I just liked more and more of what I was reading, the more that I did read. And so, yeah, my eventual, I think it was probably about 80 pages into the book itself that I realized, okay, what I had originally thought of Derrida this is not the guy that I'm reading now. And so the conversion was complete at that point. It's not that I'm a full, I'm not fully behind Derrida and everything that he says, but I just realized the image of Derrida is different from the substance, I think. And I think, and this applied to me very much so before I read him, is that people who dislike Derrida, I think, in general, haven't read him. I think if you do take the time to read him, you realize that there's more there than you've been led to believe. And that's one of the reasons why I think also that there is something to Derrida, because I came into him looking to criticize him, and it was a genuine, authentic kind of conversion that took place. So I think that, and for me anyway, is about as strong a recommendation for Derrida as I could have had. So anyway, that's why I'm making this video, because he won me over essentially. And the video itself, the video series itself, is going to be more like my Kierkegaard videos, where in those I, rather than working through one text page by page in painstaking detail, I've read 3 of his works, and I'm just going to summarize them, or not even summarize them, but look for the key ideas and try and flesh those out. And the goal being just to get an understanding of Derrida and his philosophy, particularly early Derrida, really. So the books that I did read were Writing and Difference, which is a collection of essays Derrida wrote from 1959 to 1966, of Grammatology, which was written in 1967 or published in 1967, and an essay called Difference, which was published in 1968. So all early Derrida, but I think these 3 texts give a fairly good grounding of Derrida's philosophy. So I'm going to focus on those, and we'll just work through and see what we get. So this video, the main part of this video is going to be on structuralism, and I don't think it's going to be too long, but it's just a kind of grounding for us as we move into some of the videos that will come. So let's move into the first and only section for this video, structuralism. So structuralism is basically just the idea that the human world or human life is understandable through the interrelationships that arise between various parts within it, and which therefore can be understood or brought together to constitute a structural whole. And that's the essence of it. It kind of came about in the 1950s and 60s, the early 60s in particular. And with this kind of definition, it's rather than a discipline itself, it's more a methodology, I think, which can be applied to a variety of disciplines. And so you get the main thinkers of structuralism spread across different disciplines. Ferdinand de Saussure, not pronouncing that correctly, but that's as good as it's going to get. De Saussure was in linguistics. He's often considered the father of structuralism. Claude Lévi-Strauss, he's an anthropologist. Jacques Lacan, psychology, and Roland Barthes, who, I don't know, he's a philosopher, essayist, critic, something along those lines. But those are all kind of some of the key thinkers in structuralist thought. And essentially then what it's doing, and this is going to lead us into Derrida's criticism of it, is it's a pivot away from the content, i.e. the humans who are actually living those human lives that structuralism is looking to explain or understand. So it kind of comes, as a movement, it comes after existentialism, which delved right into the individual, the particular, the experience of an individual. And even to a certain extent as well, phenomenology. Those existentialists oftentimes took a lot from phenomenology. So it's a move away from that kind of approach to looking at the form, the structure of human life itself, stepping back a little bit, if you like, from the lived experience to place it to see it as, rather than from within, to see it kind of from without, and get a picture, an overall picture of the structure or the whole or the form that human life takes. And although Derrida definitely isn't a return to something like existentialism or phenomenology, he is looking, I think, to refocus back to the content, back on the particular, the individual, and understand human life from that perspective, rather than from this removed, detached view which looks to grasp everything as a whole. And the way I've described it here, basically he will look to understand human life with an eye on the details, rather than subsuming those details under a structure. And so what Derrida has to say about this then, that the main, I think, idea, and this is coming from writing in Difference, Derrida's main criticism is that structuralism values form over force, where form means things like relation between elements, configuration and interdependency, again looking at how the elements come together in a whole, and totality, so the overall structure, the overall whole that is human life. So with form, we're looking to, Derrida says, bring order to a thing. We're looking to subsume it under concepts and categories, giving it a kind of a shape that allows it to make sense, or that allows us to make sense of it. So again, it's that idea that we're stepping back from the details that make up the thing, the elements themselves, and looking to understand those elements within this greater totality. And that the purpose of it is to bring some order to it. Perhaps it's a little chaotic in the details. There's a lot of it's messy, right? It's not tidy, it's not clear, it's not structured or ordered. And structuralism is an attempt to step back from those messy details and grasp kind of general, universal laws, if you like, that can serve to bring some order to this chaos. So then, if that's form, force for Derrida is the exact opposite. It's that creative capacity that is inherent in anything, in human life, anything that is related to human life. And in particular, Derrida talks about works of art, particularly novels, also plays, but it applies to any kind of philosophical thinking. That it's the focus. Force is that focus on the details where there is a real sense of creativity taking place. And force is an intention that animates then this traditional form, and then lets that go on to create a new structure. So rather than locking everything in a form that is governed by ordered concepts and categories and laws, it has this sense of dynamism, which although it might crystallize in certain places, it crystallizes in such a way that there's always the potential to build something new, to create a new structure. So it never gets locked into a single structural whole that we can encapsulate and bring to some kind of completion. We can never understand it in its entirety, but because it's always creative, it's always dynamic, it's always moving in different directions. That's what this word force is looking to capture. So there is then the sense of infinite implication, which gives signified meaning no respite. And that's going to be an important idea for us: signification, signs. Signification never comes to a standstill. It's never finalized. There's always, like I said, that infinite implication. There's always creativity. There's always a thrusting into new directions and new forms. So force always signifies again and differs. And that's going to be an important word for us as well, difference. And so there is a lot in this, and only because I've already done a video on Deleuze and I read him first, but there's something like intensity in Deleuze here, that essentially that active character that catalyzes difference for Deleuze. And we get that here, and there are a lot of parallels between Deleuze and Derrida that will become apparent as we go on. And already with this distinction between form and force, we get the sense that I think Derrida isn't looking for truth. He's not looking for a true account or a complete description of anything here. Or at least the notion of truth will be irrelevant or less relevant or of diminished importance for Derrida, because he's looking to understand the thing, the phenomenon, whatever it is, whether it's a novel, whether it's an attempt to understand human life itself. He's always looking to see the details, to see how the pieces are moving, rather than stepping back and trying to finalize everything, to impose a kind of a structure, a form on this creative dynamicity that is force. So if we just continue thinking about this, everything that I'm going to talk about in this video to come kind of builds on this idea, this distinction, form versus force. So if we think about meaning, Derrida talks about the living energy of meaning, and that's a quote. And that living energy of meaning is in the content. And this is neutralized in structuralism because it gets rethought as a sterile form that essentially shuts down further thought, further progression. So you lose that. It's there in the quote, the living energy of meaning, when you step back from the phenomenon, when you try to understand it, when you try to impose a structure, a form on it. You lose that creativity, that dynamism, that living energy that is what is crucial for meaning for Derrida. And essentially, if you think about it, the more you distance yourself, abstract out from the particular, the less meaning there is. And I think a good example of this is science, where the goal is to come up with universal, general truths, laws that can be expressed in mathematical equations and formulae. So when you get to that level of abstraction, there is no meaning anymore. And that's often what you get from That's often why you hear from science or scientists that there is no meaning in physics, for example. They deny that there is any meaning, and they're right to do that, because there is no meaning in physics equations. Meaning arises in the details, in the individuals who are living within the world, rather than these abstract, generalized, universal equations. And it's not just science. I'm not picking on science here. I think good metaphysics as well, because it's doing the same thing. Metaphysics is an attempt to grasp, the way I define it anyway, is an attempt to grasp reality as a whole. So it's stepping back from the details, from the individuals. And the reason is it has to be able to explain those details. It has to account for those details and those individuals. So a good metaphysical account of reality will also lose meaning. Meaning's not at that level of description. It comes in at the details, the particulars. And you get that sense in structuralism too, that it's a step back to bring everything under a form, a structure. And when you do that, inevitably you lose meaning. And that's not necessarily a criticism, because I'm all for science, I'm all for good metaphysics, but it's just that there is no meaning in those dimensions, at those levels. So you need meaning arises further on in the details, in the particulars. So anyway, you lose that sense of, you lose meaning when you through structuralism from Derrida's perspective. Another important aspect here is completion and teleology. So if we just start with completion, the idea, structuralism prioritizes completion in a form. So it brings an end to investigation, because the thing, the phenomenon, whatever it is, has been explained once and for all. However, Derrida notes that it's not that there's no completion in force in his approach. Rather, it's that force aims for coherence and completion at levels, at certain levels, instead of at the level of the totality, instead of at the whole. So you get coherence and completion at stages which are therefore temporary, provisional, and productive. So you still have a sense of completion at various points within that totality, but it's completion that is always ready to spread. It's always on a springboard, ready to move into another structure. It's always creative. It's always moving, dynamic. That's the idea with force here. So maybe we could call that relative completion. There's relative completion in Derrida's account, as opposed to the absolute completion that structuralism looks for. And regarding teleology, because the focus is on the completed structure in structuralism, the work, and I'm talking about a specific, I think Derrida is talking about a novel in this, at this point in the essay, but the work or the phenomenon gets interpreted in terms of its destination. So you're not understanding things as they happen, which is the way that they are. Rather, you're understanding them in relation to this eventual endpoint. And so it's essentially a retroactive or retrograde way of trying to understand something. And if you think about this is what we used to see. I think we see it less now, but we used to see it in when we were talking about evolution, people used to see evolution and try and understand evolution as a series of steps that culminate in human beings. And if you have human beings as the endpoint in mind, then you can kind of justify various steps along that path, the evolutionary path, that get you there. But because you're starting with the end in mind and looking backwards, your reasoning is going to be flawed. It's going to be biased or prejudiced towards this ultimate goal. So you're getting a jaundiced view of the phenomenon you're trying to understand, in this case evolution. And this is the idea behind the blind watchmaker, right? That evolution is not moving towards a goal. And you've got to understand evolution as goalless. You've got to understand it without having a specific endpoint in mind, simply because if you do, you're going to get an incorrect account of evolution. You're going to be biased by this teleological way of understanding things. Another problem with the teleological focus, is that Derrida says it tends to reject things that don't conform to the ideal type. And I guess this is similar to what I was just saying. If you have an endpoint in mind, then you discard or ignore things that don't conform to that. And so again, it's just a way of biasing your investigation, biasing your description. And it makes perfect sense too if you think about the way that we should do any kind of investigation. If you start with a goal, then you're biasing the procedures in your investigation. Everything that you do is going to be slightly inclined towards this path, rather than seeing the things as they really are. You're seeing them with this tendency towards your goal. So you're going to exclude certain things that don't align with that would seem not to get you to that final end point, and you're going to favor certain things that do seem like they align with that end point. And that's never a good thing for an honest investigation of anything. Another area that comes up here is time. And we'll talk more about time later, but Derrida mentions it in this essay. He talks about the time of structuralism being a metaphysics of simultaneity. And I'm not going to go into what Derrida means by metaphysics just yet, but what he means when he says structuralism embodies this metaphysics of simultaneity is that the task of, and he's talking again about reading and I think novels again, the task of reading is to overcome the duration in the work and make the book, make the story present itself all at once. So looking to go beyond, again, the genuine, actual way that the story unfolds, and step back from it, take this abstract view and see it as a completed whole. See it as having happened or presenting itself all at once. So essentially taking out the element of duration from the book, from the story. And again, this is a retroactive or retrograde way of understanding a work, like a novel. It means that you can't understand the book until you've finished it and you see the whole, and then you impose this structural totality upon it, which explains it. But then you can do that, and you can't. It's true, you can't understand a book until you've finished it. But if you restrict your account, your understanding of the book to that completed totality, then you miss the stages within it, which were the important parts, which were the way that the story progressed, step by step, piece by piece, within that whole, is what the story is. To reduce it to this completed totality is to lose all of that, to lose all of that detail, to lose all of that meaning, that significance, which is in the contents, in the details. And although I mentioned duration here, kind of favorably from Derrida's perspective, he's not in favor of duration itself. It's not duration over stasis, if you like. And we'll talk more about this later, but in terms of structuralism, this is a part of Derrida's critique here, that taking the totality, the whole, the completed whole, robs you of this aspect of the phenomenon, in this case the book, the story. And finally, beauty. Derrida mentions beauty here. He says beauty is in the force, not in reducing everything to a structure, not in the form. And this is really a different way of thinking about beauty, I think, that is actually quite anti-Platonic, because for Plato, beauty was in the forms, right, that are complete, that are eternal, that are permanent. And Derrida is saying, no, beauty's in the incomplete, the temporary, the messy details. It's not in this abstract, idealized, perfect way of understanding anything. It's in the midst of that, all that creativity, that chaos, that chaotic activity, that dynamism that's taking place, where nothing's fixed, nothing can be fixed. Everything's changing, everything's evolving and progressing and moving into different forms and borrowing elements from different areas, and it's all this chaotic jumble. That's where beauty lies for Derrida. And that's an interesting approach. It's an interesting way of thinking about that, right? And with a lot of this as well, it's not so much that one is right and the other's wrong. You've got to take Derrida's beauty over Plato's, or Plato's over Derrida's. It's one or the other. It's often that both capture something important, both capture something significant, and something that is, for want of a better word, correct or true about a phenomenon. And our goal is not so much to pick one side, but to recognize the value that both perspectives bring, and the truth to both perspectives. And I'm finding that more and more. I don't know if it's just because I'm getting older and I'm looking for harmony between different philosophers or philosophies. But I feel like often the more I read kind of one viewpoint, I can see the value in it, even though I can see the value in the exact opposite viewpoint as well. And it's less a matter of, well, it's not either or, it's both and. And it's just something to think about, I think. And an important idea to keep in mind, especially when you're reading philosophy, rather than kind of getting drawn into one camp and then, staking your claim somewhere and then having to defend it from all other areas, which isn't to say that all philosophies are true or all have value, but it's just that often there are these different viewpoints that aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, I think, but rather can be complementary, even though they're often not presented in that way. Okay, so that's us for today. Let's have a look at a summary. So structuralism, first, this prioritizes form. So this gives us something that is kind of, to use a negative term, but sterile, general, abstract. And with this kind of detached viewpoint, which robs you of meaning, which means that you lose an element of significance when you're contemplating the phenomenon. Form is also completed and teleological. So this then, if it's completed, it's finished, it shuts down further inquiry, shuts down productive thought. And the teleological aspect means that work gets interpreted in terms of the destination, or the phenomenon gets interpreted in terms of its destination, rather than investigating the thing as it actually happens. It also rejects what doesn't conform to its ideal type, to anything that doesn't fit into that trajectory heading towards that goal tends to get ignored or seen with a diminished sense of importance. And form gives us a metaphysics of simultaneity. So it aims to present the work all at once, eschewing that duration that comes with, that was actually present in the work. And then we've got Derrida's approach, which prioritizes force, which is creative and individual, a focus on the details, the content, rather than a stepping back to look at the form. So this creativity of force, force means that something that the elements always signify again, and they always differ. So there's always more happening. There's always more. It's productive. Force is productive. And it means that it's meaningful, because the focus is again back on the content rather than this abstracted totality, which is perhaps pleasing from an intellectual perspective, but has covered over a lot of the details, which are what the thing actually is, and in covering over those details, or in stepping back from those details, it loses the meaning that was intrinsic to them. Coherence and completion here happens in the levels, not the totality. So you still get a sense of completion, but it's a temporary completion. It's a completion that is always primed for a move into a new structure. Duration we talked about here as bringing us back to what's happening within the phenomenon itself. So it's a return to that lived aspect. And the beauty, the notion of beauty for Derrida, which we saw was very much anti-Platonic. Beauty being in the messy, the incomplete, and the temporary. So those are the two main ways to think about this. I think in this kind of a good way to start, a good grounding to move, to go from, to look at some of the ideas that characterize Derrida's philosophy, the way that he's reacting to the structuralist way of thinking, which prioritizes form, and he's trying to pull it back a little bit to bring the focus back to force, which has more of that creative, dynamic sense to it. But that's where we'll finish up for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.